I've interviewed people. I've been a journalist for a long time. I haven't been interviewed very much. So I realized how vulnerable those people were in sharing those stories. I'm Marina Kamenev, and I wrote the book Kin. It's my first book, and my publisher's NewSouth. In this, it's nonfiction. It's kind of exploring our ideas of families and which families fit into those ideas and which families don't, and why. I interviewed the people impacted by fertility treatment, and I interviewed women who couldn't have kids and women who didn't want kids, and lawyers to try and understand what the law was about, and probably scientists. There were a lot of people. Oh my gosh, how many? You know what? Because I cut chapters, so I think I had a spreadsheet because I needed to check quotes, but like more than 100. I mean, my favorite was Andrew Solomon, whose writing I love, and it was really special to interview him. Andrew Solomon is a wonderful writer who wrote Far from the Tree, which is an amazing book about, he calls it horizontal differences, and it's the differences parents and children have, and how parents can relate to kids who are completely different to them, profoundly different. One of the chapters is people without kids, and I interviewed women specifically because I think there's less pressure on men to have kids. And I interviewed women in heterosexual relationships specifically because those are the women who really get interrogated. And it included women who don't want kids and women who do want kids but can't have them. My second chapter is single mothers by choice, then rainbow families, donor insemination, not in that order necessarily, surrogacy, and I did one chapter about the future of all this technology. It sounds so obvious, but just as a starting point, I didn't really understand how terrible things were for women, how little choice they had. I sort of knew they couldn't vote, but I thought, well, the selection was probably really crappy at the time, and I just didn't realize how little choice they had over the trajectory of their lives, and how, since having choice, like the way the world has changed, and it's something so basic, but that was one of the things. And also how much we know and how little we know, like the nature of reproduction, and even the fact that we didn't see a sperm until I think it was the 17th century. So the idea that we actually didn't know how humans were made for such a long time was really remarkable. There were many surprising things, many quirky things, and just our aversion to anything new or any new ways of doing things. That was another thing I learned. Identity is always something I've taken for granted. I never really thought about it. I know where I come from. I think I know. I haven't done the testing, but therefore I'm not that interested. And I when you're missing that part of your identity, and especially when you discover that you're missing a part of it at a later age, it's very discombobulating. And there's something called genealogical bewilderment, which was researched that on adoptees who knew they were adopted, and they would look in the mirror and have this kind of horrible relationship with their reflection because they didn't know where their features came from. And a lot of donor conceived people who I interviewed, they experienced that. And in fact, there's almost a pattern when someone finds out they're donor conceived, and I say a pattern from the 4 books and the people I interviewed, there was a pattern, and they run to the mirror. And there's something about the mirror that kind of becomes almost antagonistic. I never realized how awful that is on a practical level as well. I guess I always thought love is what matters. I never paid much attention to blood. But when you don't know where you come from, especially things like dating, when you're dating in your 20s and you don't know if that's a half sibling or not. And then when, you don't know your medical history. So like on a practical level, it's a very difficult thing to have to live with. And I think at early on, fertility doctors would kind of say it doesn't matter, but equally, they would encourage parents to lie about the way the kids were created. So it obviously did matter. And I guess now, when you have companies like Ancestry DNA that are billion-dollar companies, obviously people care. People care where they come from, and the nature of how much and why is different. But to say people don't care entirely, it's not correct. I mean, there are a number of options, and it's kind of it depends what people mean by naturally as well, because natural's it's a funny word. Women who cannot conceive with sexual intercourse because they're socially infertile, they could obtain sperm, whether it's from a clinic or from Facebook, which a few people do, and occasionally they get pregnant from that. Then there's IVF, where then that's more the domain of heterosexual people. And of course, women in same sex relationships and single women also use that, where the egg and sperm is combined and fertilization occurs outside the body. And then what happened was ICSI, which is a technology where you manually fertilize an egg. And that kind of changed the fertility industry yet again, because for a while, straight couples were the ones who would use donor insemination. But to have a low sperm count, it's not all that low. Like, low sperm count is under 15 million spermatozoa per milliliter. All you need is one good sperm. And the image of people see of IVF, where you got the egg and it's sort of pierced, like it's like a lollipop. That's actually ICSI. That's not IVF. And what that meant was heterosexual couples no longer needed to use donor insemination, and that's when it became the domain of single women and women in same-sex relationships. And then there's also egg donation. And egg donation is really kind of interesting because we've had like a lot of the misogyny that exists is partially due to paternal insecurity, the idea that a woman will always know where the child came from and a man doesn't. And when you have egg donation, it's kind of introduced this idea that the woman who's carrying the child isn't the biological mother of the child. And normally, of course, they know this, but there have been cases of IVF in America and possibly here where a woman's given birth to an embryo that's not hers. So it's introduced kind of it's placed a schism on motherhood. Women who are older can use egg donation, and egg donation has also allowed surrogacy to happen because it means that a pregnancy can happen in someone else's body. And single men, men in same-sex couples, I mean, and in heterosexual relationships, that's something people were sharing intimate details of their lives. And I realize now, I've interviewed people, I've been a journalist for a long time. I haven't been interviewed very much. So I realize how vulnerable those people were in sharing those stories. I mean, I think about them often at different times. The story of Elizabeth, the woman who always wanted kids, and the timing just never aligned. She got older, she tried to adopt, and she loved kids in a way that, I love kids, but I would not work at a daycare. Elizabeth did. And a mother at the daycare confided in her that she had used egg donation, and Elizabeth ended up using egg donation, an egg donor, well, and a sperm donor, in Greece to have a child in her 50s. So that was remarkable. Alan News, he was a small part of the book, but what I found interesting with him was he was always not obsessed, but he had a relationship with his German roots. And at some stage, he found out he was donor conceived. And those roots didn't exist because he didn't have that background. And I thought that was just fascinating because I don't have that much interest in my roots to begin with, but to have that part of your identity taken away from you I think in his 30s or 40s. That was really remarkable. Kate and Diane, I loved. I loved speaking to Kate because she was just so honest with me about using. She used a donor from Facebook, and I'll never forget what she said when I asked what her criteria was, and she just said anyone with a pulse. And I really loved her story, and I loved it as well because one thing that I found interesting is how different the choices people make are when they use technology and when they have someone standing in front of them. Because some of the American banks, you have you can have an uncle, your grandparents' health history in such a high level of detail. I don't have that about my own family. I wouldn't have that about my husband's family. And it's interesting the way you pick a person in person and the way you pick a person on paper. And I find those things really interesting. We've reacted to everything, including test tube babies, as if it's a danger. I just think we haven't decided what's a health trait or what's an aesthetic trait. And I think we don't know what we're choosing and why. And I guess in America in particular, there's a lot of companies, and maybe they're in Australia now, where you can choose your embryo based on intelligence. And the technology may or may not work. But there are other factors as well. I mean, I often think of something just like height or, looks or even race. I think picking race is really interesting because if you pick someone of the same race, are you being racist? Whereas if you pick someone of a different race, you're actually not qualified necessarily to raise someone who looks different to you because they might experience different problems. And I've interviewed people who have done both. And I guess, yeah, we just kind of haven't really decided on what these things mean. It's really interesting, the idea of the family, because even I open the book with by asking people to draw a family, and it's a mum and dad and two kids. And I think a lot of people, if they were asked to choose a family, they would still pick that family. But whether that's what they consider family necessarily doesn't correspond. It's not the same. And I think there was a survey lately, conveniently after I published the book, by the Australian Institute of Family Studies. And what I loved about it was that they asked what does family mean, and they had 5 or so categories, and those born prior to World War I, but from memory, they valued blood a lot more. Those born in the Gen X era, they didn't value blood so much, and you can actually see the change. So everyone kind of believed in love, but the difference, it's changing kind of over time. I was born in Russia, in Belgorod, which is now near the border of Ukraine. At the time, it was the USSR. So my father's technically Ukrainian, my mother's Russian for what it's worth. And we moved to Australia when I was 6. And yes, I was part of a nuclear family, which wasn't, I call it Russian nuclear because it didn't come with the gender roles. And I think in Russia, it never did. I covered that a little bit in the book. So my mum worked, my dad worked. There was no assumption that the woman stays home, and there was no guilt about it, which I really appreciated. And my grandparents did a lot of the child raising once they immigrated here. So that was part of it. And then through a lot of zigging and zagging, I became a journalist, and I moved back to Russia, but this time to Moscow. And it was a different country at the time. And I worked there for 2 years, which was a really fascinating experience. And then I had a nuclear family of my own.